Hair transplants in younger people is a most interesting topic. Indeed, I am an example of this. I had a hair transplant at 23. Many people will say, were you not concerned at such a young age? No, of course not, because my case allowed for it. And this is the key. It's case dependent. This whole thing about you have to be a minimum of 25 years is a load of rubbish because it's case dependent. Also, should all the pieces line up and you are a good candidate, what is the point in waiting? Life is too short. Your 20s and your 30s are only lived once and are perhaps the most important years of your life while your health is good. So my argument is, if the pieces line up and you are a good candidate, you should absolutely have a transplant in your 20s and enjoy life thoroughly. This doesn't apply, obviously, if you're not a good candidate. So it begs the question, what is a good candidate? This can only really be correctly assessed by a surgeon, which I am not, of course. I'm a patient. But it's interesting to discuss these things, and I can say what I can say purely as a patient, as someone who can be offered as a case study because I'm a younger guy. I'm still young. I'm still 27, and boy, was it worth it. Oh my God, it was totally worth it. And that was only 4 years ago, you know? But what is a good candidate? Okay, well, a good candidate is one who doesn't obviously have aggressive hair loss to begin with. One whose crown is intact. Because if you have crown miniaturization at an early age, this is a terrible sign. If you have hair loss in the front and you're following the typical Norwood scale, but yet the hairs on the rest of the scalp aren't miniaturized, this is a good sign. Something can be done, i.e. a band, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But ultimately, one must catch this early, as I was saying in the previous video. And if you catch it early and you intervene, you have many, many, many years ahead of you to do things with. How do you intervene? Well, I argue that finasteride on its own or oral minoxidil on its own is not enough, especially oral minoxidil on its own. It's useless. They must be taken together. Obviously, finasteride will reduce the DHT, and we know that DHT causes miniaturization, so you help slow down that process. Finasteride will make your hair a little bit healthier. Obviously, it can, I found, help repigment it actually, which is a sign that the hair is coming back. It works particularly well on the mid-scalp, on the crown, to a lesser extent on the front. Often by the time you have miniaturization on the front, it's time for surgery. Now, when you take it in conjunction with oral minoxidil, you are seriously increasing the longevity of your hair, because oral minoxidil will push more of the hairs into the anagen phase, the growth phase, but most importantly, they lengthen the anagen phase. As I was saying, every one of us has an anagen phase that is unique to us. We have a finite amount of them in our life, depending on our genetic time clock. So one really wants to lengthen the anagen phase, because then you are increasing the amount of time that you simply have hair on your head. It makes a lot of sense. Also, what we notice with oral minoxidil is the hair thickens. There's some repigmentation as well. These are all signs of reversing the miniaturization process, because when your hair starts to get a bit lighter in color, it loses its pigment. This is often signs of miniaturization. You notice that the area also gets thinner. You can't hold a comb through it like you did before. The style of it is affected. Miniaturization, it's all classic signs. So when you take them together, you increase the longevity of your hair. You're a younger guy. You're also assuming a good candidate, as in you don't have aggressive genes for hair loss, and you've caught it in time. Good for you. Unfortunately, most people don't catch it in time. Most people are afraid to make appointments with hair restoration clinics. Remember, a hair restoration clinic doesn't mean you're going to get a hair surgery. They offer crucial services such as taking pictures at high resolution under the correct lighting and making a photographic assessment, often using magnification to see miniaturized hairs on the head, so you can take a closer look and see what's coming down the road that you can't see yourself really with the naked eye. Then they get you on medication because they give you a prescription. A GP is very unlikely to prescribe you oral minoxidil, and probably unlikely to prescribe you finasteride as well, because it's not their forte. Most GPs are unfamiliar with this because most patients do not come in looking for this. You must go to a specialist. If you want a prescription for finasteride and oral minoxidil, you must really go to a hair restoration clinic. They are the ones who are likely to prescribe it to you. Certainly finasteride. Oral minoxidil, yeah, possibly. Some hair restoration clinics don't prescribe it, but I firmly believe this is changing. The tide has turned, especially with some of the recent presentations at the conferences and the work of the academic Rodney Sinclair in Australia. So oral minoxidil is really becoming an adjunct now and gaining popularity. So you take them both together anyway, you increase the longevity of your hair. Now it's transplant time. This is where I think the most important thing one can do as a younger patient. Use obviously as least grafts as possible to get the best benefit, but do a band. So you see the hair here. All of this on me is natural, it's native. However, this is also native. This is my own hair. There is a transplant going on here. There's a transplant going on here. It's so well blended. This is transplanted. This is transplanted as well. There's a few things going on here. So one, this is a band. So a band on a younger man creates symmetry. It helps replicate what they've had all these years before as a teenager. Teenagers there's no such thing as a purely symmetrical hairline, by the way. But in general, we use the term symmetrical because it looks similar, but it isn't really. Remember, imperfection is perfection. But the whole point of this is the hairline, the symmetrical hairline, provides symmetry to the face. It frames the face, and this is very important as a younger guy if you're going to get this done. But also, because the transplanted hairs from the donor last longer in time, this is then going to last longer in time. So you do top-ups as the years go on until the area becomes mostly transplanted, and thus it is more likely to retain. There's always going to be remnants of it. But of course we know that some donor hairs do miniaturize to different extents. But in general, the area at the back of the head is the safe zone, right? So you do the band, and then your plan is obviously going forward to do some filling in work up the road. It's up to you if you're going to do FUT or FUE. Personally, just my personal choice as a patient, remember, I'm not a surgeon. I chose FUT because it is the thickest and healthiest hairs at the back of the head that are in the safest area. And by having the thickest hairs here, you get the most density, pi r squared. The increased radius caliber of those hairs gives more coverage. It's common sense. And you want density here because then that's more youthful. You can do more styles. There's nothing worse than a very, very soft hairline that has no density to it. What can you do with that? You need to have density and refinement. It needs to be a degree of both for a natural result, but for a practical result, because we all want density. Now, temple point reconstruction is a totally different ballgame, and you have to be very careful what surgeon you go for that. It is a cherry on top, but it must be done right. I've talked about it in another video where I talk about the whole temporal point, so I'm not going to talk about that again now. But this is the important thing, getting that hairline band, because then going forward you can start to fill it in and fill in behind it. But also, this is what is amazing, what gives a true natural result if you're a younger man and you've caught your hair loss in time. You will have a degree of miniaturized hairs still present on the scalp. They will be thinner naturally. So when you go and you do a band into that area, because it hasn't become slick bald yet, you get the best result possible because you're combining those thick grafts with thinner hairs. In nature, this is what happens. You have thinner hairs. So by combining these, you get a result that looks less and less transplanted. This is indeed what I have. There's some finer hairs here that were miniaturized and then cut in time, and then there's some really thick, good quality strip grafts, and this is why it looks not terribly transplanted. Most people who would see this would not know that I've had a hair transplant done. That is the amazing thing about combining and placing grafts between existing hairs. Whereas if you go to an area on the scalp that has no hair, let's say it's slick bald, and you transplant it, I guarantee you it will look to a degree transplanted. Whereas you're going to hide it much, much better. You might not even be able to detect it yourself when you start transplanting among miniaturizing hair, existing hair, but you're going to obviously slow the process down because, as you said, as we were talking about, you're going to take medication. However, medication only buys you time. Those hairs destined to fall out very likely will. I've experienced it myself. Remember, I've had 2 transplants and a third will be coming. So, so it's, and a 4th will then be coming. You get what I'm saying? It's all about buying time, but we're not on this earth for terribly long anyway, so we can afford to do this. Go for it. But anyways, then be prepared for those miniaturized hairs to eventually become so thin that you will require more surgery up the road. And slowly but surely you're building a canvas that is more and more transplanted. So I think this is how it can be possible to do these things. But as I was saying, it is crucial to catch this in time. I can't say this enough. You must see a specialist. If you had an issue with your tooth, you would go to a dentist, wouldn't you? But when your hair is in poor health, you're reluctant to seek medical options. And it's funny how we're reluctant to do this, isn't it? I find it fascinating. Now, I never felt like this at all. The first time that I saw miniaturization, I contacted a clinic here in Ireland to address the issue, just as I would go to my GP for a sore throat, just as I go to, as I was saying, the dentist for a yearly checkup, or if I have a toothache, this sort of thing. It's the exact same thing. It's medical intervention for a medical issue. And perhaps it's due to stigma, perhaps it's due to pricing. It's not a cheap game. But what's the alternative? Letting it get worse and slowly going down the rabbit hole into oblivion of feeling worse and worse about yourself? What kind of labyrinth is that? That's torture. Whereas you can fix this problem by seeking help. So I thoroughly encourage this. Hope you found this video interesting. The very best of luck as always with your endeavours regarding hair. And thank you so much for listening.